Hello and welcome to this lecture, the first of a pair of lectures on Japanese history and culture and Japan's continuing influence on the evolution of Eastern civilization between the 12th and 20th centuries. When we were last in Japan, we saw how late in the 11th century, despite the sophistication of life and culture in the imperial Heian court, the Japanese countryside was in a state of decline. The equal field system designed to equitably distribute land to the peasants and the landlords, and as we've seen, one of the most ancient economic and social systems of all Eastern civilization began to fall apart. It was the aristocratic clans that now accumulated most of the land for themselves in a competitive territory grab backed by their own powerful armies. By the 12th century, the two most powerful clans of all, the Taira and the Minamoto, were engaged in open war, from which in the year 1185, the Minamoto emerged victorious. They claimed the right to rule in the name of the Heian emperor, but they also quickly installed a shogun, or military governor, to take command of the state. The outcome of this new system was that it was the shogun who now exercised real power in Japan, although he was careful to always pay due ceremonial deference to the hereditary emperor. The Minamoto established the new seat of their government at Kamakura and went on to rule Japan for the next several centuries. Kamakura today is a small regional town about 30 miles south-southwest of Tokyo. It was Yoritomo, the leader of the victorious Minamoto clan in 1185, who chose Kamakura to be the seat of his new government because this was the location of his ancestral family home. Just like the Fujiwara clan that had dominated politics during the late Heian period, the Minamoto did not seek to abolish imperial authority, but simply claimed the right to rule in the name of the emperor, who was in reality powerless and thus could do nothing to dispute this. The emperor and his imperial court remained at Kyoto, and the shogun ruled now from Kamakura. Thus began the so-called medieval period of Japan's history, which I would like to explore with you today by considering two distinct shogunate eras. The first of these is the era of the Kamakura and succeeding Muromachi shogunates, a period of almost 300 years from 1185 through to 1465. The second is the era of the Tokugawa shogunate, which ruled Japan from Edo Castle near Tokyo between 1600 and 1868, when they were replaced by the Meiji government, beginning a period that historians have called ever since the Meiji Restoration. In between the end of the Muromachi in 1465 and the establishment of the Tokugawa in 1600, Japan essentially experienced its own warring states era. Western historians sometimes refer to the Kamakura and Muromachi shogunates as Japan's medieval period, and indeed I used that phrase just a moment or so ago. But the use of the label medieval Japan, and for that matter the phrase classical Japan, which is sometimes applied to the Nara and Heian periods, is rejected by other historians because it seems to apply a European chronological periodization scheme to a uniquely East Asian historical process. Those historians who do use the descriptor medieval justify this by applying the strict Latin meaning of the word medieval, literally Middle Age. They see medieval Japan as a middle era falling between the Nara and Heian imperial periods, which, as we have seen, were dominated by Chinese cultural influence, and the modern age instigated by the Tokugawa dynasty in the 17th century, which began to introduce a more Western-style, centralized and unified government to Japan. Some historians also refer to the medieval period as feudal, but the term descented is more commonly used today because feudalism also has so many specific and particular associations with European history. What we can say with certainty is that during this medieval period, Japanese culture took on increasingly distinctive characteristics that differentiated it more and more from that of Korea and China. Because of this, many of the foundations of Eastern civilization, including ancient ideas about the mechanism of governance, political philosophy, social structures, and attitudes towards women, were modified and transformed by Japanese shogunate politics and culture. To the Kamakura shogunate first, which lasted from 1185 to 1333. Now, the victorious Minamoto clan, which instituted the Kamakura shogunate, is widely celebrated in Japanese books, movies, and TV today. The powerful leader Yoritomo forced the emperor to grant him the title of shogun, and he became supreme military and political commander of Japan. Although the shoguns ruled from Kamakura, they were careful to pay utmost respect to the emperor. Although many historians are uncomfortable applying the term feudal to Japanese history, the Kamakura shogunate did introduce a quasi-feudal system. That is, both the Kamakura and subsequent Muromachi shogunates were characterized by a decentralized political and economic system in which provincial lords exercised great power in all the local regions where they controlled the land and the economy. They had little to no respect for the refined conduct that had prevailed at the Chinese-style Heian court. Rather, they valued military talent and discipline above courtesy and etiquette. It was in this political and ideological context that the mounted warrior, known as the samurai, began to play a distinctive and major role in Japanese life. The origins of the samurai can be traced back to reforms introduced back in the 8th century, whereby 1 in every 3 or 4 males were drafted into the military, a part of an attempt by the imperial government to establish a Chinese-style professional military force. These soldiers were expected to provide their own weapons and in return were exempted from taxes. As part of the same series of reforms, 12 new classes of bureaucrats were also established. Those of the 6th class and below were called samurai, which comes from a Chinese word and means those who serve the nobility. Over the centuries that followed, the term samurai was gradually applied to military men, particularly to those warriors who became associated with the powerful clans. Some historians argue that these early samurai were more like mercenaries and robbers, and that until the 14th century, it would be more appropriate to describe them as violent mobsters rather than elite warriors. After the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate, the samurai were given more and more responsibilities by the shogun until they effectively became the ruling class of medieval Japan. And it was now that the more refined forms of behavior associated with the samurai in Western consciousness began to appear in a way not unlike the evolution of chivalry amongst European knights. In fact, if I can digress into European history for just a moment, I think there is an interesting comparison to be made here. It was during a period of violent disturbances in medieval Europe, including the invasions by Vikings, Saracens, Magyars, and others, that the Christian church began to form a closer relationship with secular royalty and nobility for protection. It was this relationship that improved the behavior of the nobility and their knights, in that it added Christian values to the knightly code of chivalry. During the early Middle Ages in Europe, the only code of conduct knights accepted was to maintain their military virtue, their prowess in combat, their courage, and their loyalty to each other and their lord. But later chivalry added Christian values and images. The search for the Holy Grail is an obvious example, and also stressed the reverence and protection of women. The samurai in Japan began without any code of chivalry whatsoever, but this also changed and evolved until it attained the level of the military and ethical behavior also being championed by European knights. Undoubtedly, the samurai were professional warriors. They were skilled in the martial arts and in the use of the bow and arrow and the sword, and of course they were also great horsemen. But they also subscribed to the philosophy of Bushido, the way of the warrior, not only because it emphasized superb military skills, but because it was seen as a way of gaining great honor. Bushido demanded that the samurai demonstrate an extraordinary degree of loyalty to each other, to their local overlord, known as the daimyo, and ultimately to the powerless but nonetheless still respected emperor. So in the end, the samurai became, in the main, trustworthy and honest. The same can be said of samurai women, by the way. We know of many who were expected to endure the same Spartan hardships as their male consorts and to fight to the death with their husbands. Japanese elite women actually had a long history of learning martial arts and participating in battles well before this Kamakura shogunate period. But between the 12th and 19th centuries, many young women of the samurai class became masters of the sword and the naginata, a blade attached to a long staff, and rode out to battle with their husbands. In theory, all samurai lived frugal lives with no apparent interest in riches or material things. They were interested only in military prowess and honor. The popular image of the samurai suggests that they had no fear of death. They would enter any battle, no matter the odds, because to die in battle would only bring honor to one's family and one's lord. But we do know of some cowardly, disloyal, and treacherous samurai in history who fell far short of this idealized image. Although the samurai were skilled in battle formations and combined assaults, they also sought the opportunity to fight alone, one-on-one, rather than as part of a contingent. An individual samurai, superbly armed and uniformed, would call out his family's name, rank, and accomplishments, seeking an opponent with similar rank to do battle. When the samurai killed his opponent, he often severed his head, which he took back to his base after battle to show proof of his victory. The heads of generals and those of other high ranks were transported back to the capital at Kamakura and displayed there for the officials, for the shogun to see. The only way out for a defeated samurai was death on the battlefield or death by a form of ritual suicide called seppuku. Seppuku, which literally means stomach cutting, is also known in popular Western culture as harakiri. The first recorded instance of seppuku was in the year 1180 when samurai Yorimasa of the Minamoto clan disemboweled himself after the Battle of Uji rather than suffer the shame of surrender or of falling into enemy hands. Seppuku quickly became a fundamental tenet of the samurai code of Bushido. A samurai would stab a knife or razor-sharp sword into his abdomen and then slowly cut his own stomach open. After the disembowelment, when the samurai was on the brink of death, a colleague would slice off his head. This form of suicide was performed under various circumstances, obviously to avoid the dishonor of surrender or capture in battle, but also to atone for a misdeed or any unworthy act. The bottom line is that a samurai would rather kill himself than bring shame and disgrace to his family name or his daimyo. In 1274, and again 7 years later in 1281, the Kamakura shogunate and their samurai successfully defended Japan from the Mongols, although the shogunate was weakened in the process. Both invasions failed as much because of the efforts of Mother Nature as to the military prowess of the defenders. I mean, to be absolutely honest, the sword-wielding samurai of Japan were no match for the invaders, who were armed with gunpowder cannons and other superior fighting technology and tactics. Despite their very real fear of the sea, the Mongols did succeed in landing on the shores of Kyushu Island after occupying Tsushima Island and other nearby islands on their way there. But gathering typhoon storms called kamikaze, or the divine winds, forced the Mongols to pack up and leave and head back to Korea. So glorious, so significant was this defeat of the Mongols that the term kamikaze remained in popular usage and was of course revived and used nearly 700 years later by suicide fighter pilots in the last stages of the Second World War, as we will see in our next lecture. The decades following the attempted Mongol invasion saw intermittent civil war break out in Japan as factions fought the new Muromachi shogunate government, which had replaced the weakened Kamakura shogun, ostensibly on behalf of the emperor. This increasing fragmentation of Japan led in 1467 to full-scale civil war, which lasted more or less for the next century. Despite the bitter conflict, the Japanese economy grew quickly after Portuguese missionaries and then merchants arrived, followed by other European traders. They started arriving in the early 16th century. The Portuguese traders quickly transformed the small fishing village of Nagasaki into one of the largest ports in Asia. And before long, the Spanish had made their own merchant port at Hirado, the English at Nagoya, and the Dutch on Kyushu. Thereafter, increasing numbers of European missionaries began to arrive, particularly our friends the Jesuits. And by 1600, Japan was known by and was very open to the outside world. But all that ended with the advent of the Tokugawa shogunate, which became determined to return Japan to isolation. Let me outline the circumstances for you in the second part of this lecture, which focuses on the period from 1600 through to 1868. Late in the 16th century, a series of leaders in Japan attempted to bring an end to Japan's long Warring States era. In the year 1600, one of these leaders, a man called Tokugawa Ieyasu, who ended up ruling Japan as shogun from 1600 to 1616, established a new military government known as the Tokugawa Bakufu, a word that literally means the tent government, because the Tokugawa Bakufu was only supposed to be temporary. But this temporary tent government ended up ruling Japan for more than 250 years, from 1600 through to 1868. The principal aim of the Tokugawa was to prevent a return to civil war, which meant curtailing the power of the powerful territorial lords, the daimyo. By this stage, each daimyo had their own lands, their own military forces, the samurai, of course. They had independent courts and schools. They were even printing their own money. Many daimyo had also established close relationships with European traders who helped them financially and taught them how to make and use gunpowder weapons. From the castle town of Edo, again near modern Tokyo, the Tokugawa shogun used various policies to try and reduce the power of these regional lords, the daimyo. Very similar to what we have observed in the foreign policies of both China and Korea during this same period, the shoguns also attempted to tightly control relations between Japan and the outside world. So in the 1630s, a series of laws were passed that restricted Japanese relations with foreigners, which even forbade Japanese from going abroad under pain of death. Haven't we seen similar measures passed by governments in Korea and China around the same time? The policy did allow some closely controlled trade to continue and also permitted some Chinese and Dutch merchants to continue to operate in Nagasaki, so Japan was never completely isolated. Once the daimyo were somewhat under control, political stability returned to Japan, and this allowed the Tokugawa to focus on economic growth. Production of rice, cotton and silk began to increase, and this meant that many villages were able to move away from subsistence to market farming, really for the first time in Japan's long history. Increased food production led in turn to population growth. Demographers estimate that during the 17th century, the population of Japan rose by 33% to 29 million. But the fear of overstraining resources caused many families to limit population growth, mostly through a practice of infanticide, which was euphemistically called thinning out the rice shoots. These various economic and demographic developments allowed the Tokugawa to preside over a period of marked social change in Japan. The old Confucian order had ranked the ruling elites, that is the daimyo and the samurai, as the most privileged class, followed by the peasants, the artisans, and the merchants at the bottom. But as the daimyo and the samurai lost their roles in a more peaceful Japan, many fell into financial difficulty. At the same time, merchants became increasingly wealthy and powerful, and cities and ports also began to flourish. Edo, for example, had a population of probably 1 million by the year 1700. And it was the merchants who now controlled most of this new urban wealth. Despite this, Confucianism and Chinese language and culture did remain the dominant focus of elite culture throughout the Tokugawa shogunate period. Indeed, even as late as the 19th century, elite Japanese scholars were still writing their philosophical, legal, and religious dissertations in classical Chinese. The common people also continued to embrace Buddhism, modified, as we saw in an earlier lecture, by Shintoism. But at the same time, some scholars were trying to establish a more distinctive Japanese voice and style in their work. During the 18th century in particular, the so-called native learning school publicly scorned both Neo-Confucianism and even Buddhism now as alien cultural imports. They emphasized instead the importance of Japanese folk traditions and the indigenous Shinto religion. Now, undoubtedly, there was a strong element of nationalism, even xenophobia, in this native learning movement. Many members of the native learning camp argued that Japanese culture was superior to all others, and they sought to glorify some abstract notion of ancient and pure Japanese culture before it had been polluted by Chinese, and other foreign influences. The emergence of this prosperous merchant class also led to the development of a vibrant, popular urban culture. In the great cities like Kyoto, Edo, and Osaka, Japanese entertainers now catered for a very sophisticated middle class. At the heart of the Tokugawa urban culture were the floating palaces. These were vast entertainment and pleasure emporiums that contained tea houses, brothels, and public baths. Entertainment here was secular and satirical, often ridiculing the pompous and ceremonial proceedings of the government. And this in turn led to new developments in prose fiction and theatre. One example, the prolific poet Ihara Saikaku, who lived between 1642 and 1693, helped create a new genre of prose fiction called the Books of the Floating World. In his most famous book, The Life of a Man Who Lived for Love, Ihara unfolds the experiences of urban men who devote their lives to a quest for sexual pleasure. This is a book about erotic love, not aesthetic, laid out clearly in a series of short, episodic stories. His novels appeal to the modern, literate urban resident who had no time or interest in dense Neo-Confucian texts. During the 17th century, two new forms of drama also became popular in Tokugawa cities. One of these was kabuki, which consisted of several acts of lively and often bawdy skits and was delivered using a form of highly stylized acting combined with lyric singing, with dancing, and with very modern and often abstract set designs. The other form of new and popular theatre was bunraku, puppet theatre, in which the storytellers unfolded a drama by using puppets. With three operators, the puppets could act out the most subtle and intricate of movements. From the mid-16th century on, Jesuit missionaries became increasingly vigorous in their conversion efforts in Japan, and by 1615 there were an estimated 300,000 Christians living in Japan. But because several of the daimyo had been converted, the Tokugawa was concerned to try and restrict Jesuit activities for fear that they might allow the daimyo to rebuild their former lucrative relationships with European merchants. And so in a series of violent crackdowns, very similar to what we saw happening in Choson, Korea, European Christians were tortured and executed by the government. Faced with martyrdom, some missionaries abandoned their faith altogether and became Buddhists, like the Portuguese Jesuit Cristóvão Ferreira, who after 5 hours of brutal torture renounced Christianity, changed his name to Sawano Chuan, and became one of the so-called fallen priests. Because of these persecutions, by the late 17th century, tens of thousands of Japanese Christians were dead, and thereafter Christianity survived only as an underground sect in Japan. By the early 19th century, Japanese society was in turmoil. A series of agricultural crises occurred, and harsh taxation led to a general economic crisis and even starvation amongst the rural people. Impoverished migrants now flocked to the cities, and as the price of food rose, the urban poor also experienced extreme poverty and destitution. Even the samurai and the daimyo faced hardship as they fell into debt to the wealthy and still expanding merchant class. The Tokugawa government responded to all this by passing a series of conservative reforms between 1841 and 1843, which included cancelling samurai debt and also forcing the peasants back to the land to grow rice, but the reforms all failed. Like its East Asian neighbours in the mid-19th century, Japan also came under foreign pressure, particularly from the United States, which was seeking ports for its Pacific merchant and whaling fleets. When Japan refused these requests in 1853 and again the following year, a US naval squadron under Commodore Perry trained his guns on the Tokugawa capital and demanded that the Shogun sign a treaty with the US and open Japanese ports to commercial relations. The Shogun had no alternative but to agree, and Japan was forced to sign the first of a series of unequal treaties like their contemporaries, the Qing dynasty in China. This in turn led to a domestic political crisis. Both the emperor and the daimyo bitterly resented the fact that the shogun had signed these treaties. Domestic opposition to the Tokugawa grew rapidly, particularly amongst the samurai. The Tokugawa responded by imprisoning their samurai critics. But in a brief civil war, opposition armies trained by foreign experts and armed with Western weapons put so much pressure on the Tokugawa that the shogun resigned. In January 1868, the young Emperor Meiji took power, and as we'll see next time, he went on to rule very successfully for 44 years until 1912. If I can sum up this lecture, through this long medieval period of Japanese history, the samurai and the daimyo had effectively functioned as the ruling class of Japan, although the first phase of this era degenerated into civil war in the 16th century. But the Tokugawa were able to effectively unify Japan under their leadership, and for a time, warfare disappeared and urban life flourished. Late in the Tokugawa era, the government became desperate to modernize and adopt a Western way of political and economic life. This meant that there was no longer any need for the samurai, who were now seen as an anachronism, an embarrassing relic from a bygone era. The samurai and their way of life were officially abolished in the early 1870s, events described in a movie many of you may have seen, The Last Samurai. Ultimately, both the samurai and the daimyo went the way of the Tokugawa to extinction. Next time, we bring our account of Japanese history and culture up to the mid-20th century. I'll see you soon.